My name is Chase, and I'm 28 years old. By trade, I'm an accountant, though that's mostly seasonal work during tax time. What really defines me is the 200 acres of Indiana farmland I inherited from my grandfather 3 years ago. Same soil 4 generations of my family have worked, growing corn and raising cattle just outside Bloomington. I've always been a numbers man, facts, figures, logical explanations for everything. When the books don't balance, you find the error. When cattle get spooked, there's a predator nearby. When crops fail, you check the soil pH and rainfall data. Everything has a reason rooted in reality. My grandfather used to tell stories that didn't fit that worldview. Tales about something that stalked our property when the moon was dark. Something that walked upright like a man but hunted like a wolf. He'd point to unexplained deaths, strange tracks that appeared overnight, and that feeling of being watched from the tree line. "It's been testing our family for generations," he'd whisper, pressing his old .45 Colt revolver into my hands. "Someday it'll test you too." I figured it was just the rambling of an old farmer whose mind had started slipping. Rural folklore mixed with too many lonely nights. When I took over the farm, I kept his revolver out of respect, but I never expected to need it for anything more dangerous than putting down a sick animal. That changed 3 weeks ago. October had been routine until then. Harvest season keeping me busy from dawn to dusk, preparing for winter, fixing equipment. I'd been living alone since my divorce finalized. Just me, the cattle, and the familiar rhythms of farm life. The kind of peaceful existence where your biggest worry is whether the weather will hold long enough to get the last of the corn in. I should have paid attention when the cattle started acting strange, clustering together and refusing to graze near the barn. Should have wondered why my chickens wouldn't leave their coop, even during the day. But I was focused on practical concerns. Feed costs, equipment maintenance, the normal challenges of working land that's been in my family since before I was born. Then I found Rex's collar. Rex was my border collie. Smart, loyal, never wandered far from the property. Found his collar hanging from the fence wire near the north pasture. Torn clean through. Blood still wet on the leather. No body, no tracks I could identify. Just that collar swaying in the morning breeze like some kind of warning. The next morning I found the tracks. I'd stepped out at dawn to check the cattle, my boots crunching through frost-stiff grass. The air bit clean, carrying that October smell of dying leaves and coming winter. Everything seemed normal until I rounded the corner of the barn and stopped dead. There, pressed deep into the mud beside the water trough, was a print unlike anything I'd ever seen. I crouched down, my knees popping in the cold. The track was massive, easily twice the size of my Timberland boot when I placed it alongside for comparison. But it wasn't just the size that made my stomach clench. The shape was all wrong. Too long, too narrow, with distinct claw marks gouged deep into the earth. 4 toes, each ending in what looked like knife cuts in the mud. My accounting brain kicked in automatically, trying to catalog what I was seeing. Length, 14 inches. Width, maybe 6. Depth, at least 2 inches, suggesting something incredibly heavy. But the pattern, that's what made my hands shake as I traced the air above the print. The stride was too long for something moving on 4 legs. The prints formed a line, one after another, like a man walking upright. But no man had feet like these. I followed the trail with growing unease. It led from the tree line past the barn, straight to the cattle pen. At each print, those claw marks had torn through mud and grass like razors. Near the fence, I found where something had paced back and forth. The ground churned with overlapping tracks. The trail ended at the fence line, but the creature hadn't climbed over. The prints simply stopped, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I stood there in the crisp morning silence, staring at evidence my practical mind couldn't explain away. These weren't dog tracks. No dog in Indiana grew this large. They weren't bear tracks either. Bears didn't walk upright for 30 yards. And their claws didn't leave marks like surgical cuts. As I straightened up, my grandfather's words echoed in my memory. The shadow that walks like a man but hunts like a wolf. For the first time in 3 years since inheriting this land, I felt like a stranger on my own property. Something had been here in the darkness, studying my animals, my home. Something that left tracks suggesting it stood taller than me and moved with purpose I couldn't fathom. The numbers didn't add up, and that terrified me more than anything. Walking toward the pasture that morning, I expected to find my herd grazing near the fence line like always. Instead, all 30 head were pressed against the far corner, as far from the barn as they could get. Their eyes rolled white when I approached, nostrils flaring at some scent I couldn't detect. "Easy, girls," I murmured. But even Bessie, my calmest Holstein, shied away from my outstretched hand. The chickens were worse, usually scattered across their run by sunrise, pecking and clucking. Today they huddled silent inside their coop. I rattled the feed bucket, but not one emerged. Through the wire mesh, I could see them pressed together in the darkest corner, beaks tucked low. That's when I noticed the silence. No bird song, no insects buzzing. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the entire farm was holding its breath. Animals know things we don't. Their instincts reach back thousands of years to when everything in the dark wanted to eat them. I should have listened to their instincts. Instead, I did what any practical man would do. Checked the property line for holes in the fencing. Called the sheriff about possible predators. Even contacted my neighbors to see if they'd lost any livestock. Nobody had answers. Nobody had seen anything unusual. But something was watching me figure that out. Something patient enough to wait for the right moment. Smart enough to stay hidden. And strong enough to tear through metal fencing like paper when it finally decided to introduce itself. That evening I sat in my grandfather's old recliner, trying to focus on ledger entries for the Henderson account. The numbers blurred together as my mind kept drifting to Rex's torn collar and those impossible tracks. I'd checked every gate twice, counted the cattle 3 times, and still felt like something fundamental had shifted on my land. The first howl came at 9:47 p.m. I remember because I just glanced at the mantel clock, wondering if I should give up on the books for the night. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. Deeper than a coyote's yip, more resonant than a dog's bay, it rolled across my fields with an intelligence that made my accounting-trained mind rebel against what my ears were telling me. Coyotes don't howl with that kind of purpose. I set down my pen and listened. Silence stretched for maybe 2 minutes. Then another howl answered from the opposite direction, near the old grain silo. My blood went cold. 2 of them? But as the third call echoed from somewhere behind the barn, I realized something worse. The timing was too perfect, the spacing too deliberate. This wasn't a pack communicating. This was one creature moving impossibly fast around my property, circling like a predator, testing the perimeter. I grabbed my grandfather's .45 from the gun safe and stepped onto the porch. The October air bit through my work shirt, but I barely noticed. Another howl, this one closer to the house, carried an almost musical quality that raised every hair on my neck. There was something disturbingly human about the cadence, like speech disguised as animal sound. The cattle were lowing in their pen, not the usual evening complaints, but panicked bellows. Whatever was out there, they could smell it, sense it in ways my civilized brain couldn't process. I stood there for an hour, the .45 heavy in my grip, listening to that thing patrol my land. The howls came in patterns, 3 short, 1 long, then silence before starting again from a new location. Each cycle brought it closer to the house. When it finally stopped around midnight, the silence felt worse than the sounds had been. I knew it was still out there, watching from the darkness between my corn rows, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old farmhouse made me reach for the revolver. By dawn, I'd made a decision that would have seemed insane just days before. I was going to hunt whatever was hunting me. My grandfather's warnings suddenly didn't seem like folklore anymore. At 11:47 p.m. the following night, I gave up pretending I could rest. I pulled on my boots and grabbed the heavy mag light from the kitchen drawer. The revolver's weight felt foreign against my hip as I stepped onto the porch. October air bit through my flannel shirt, sharp and clean, but underneath lurked something else. That musky, wild scent I'd been catching in whiffs all week. The barn loomed 60 yards across the yard, a black rectangle against the star-scattered sky. My footsteps crunched on gravel, unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Even the wind had died. Something was watching me. The sensation crawled up my spine like ice water. I'd felt eyes on me before, neighbors checking on crops, deer at the woodline. But this was different. Predatory, patient, intelligent. I clicked on the flashlight, sweeping its beam across the path. Nothing but familiar territory, the water trough, fence posts, scattered hay bales. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step toward the barn. 20 yards out, I stopped. The large sliding door stood slightly ajar, exactly how I'd left it that morning. But something felt wrong. The darkness beyond seemed too deep, too complete. I reached for the door handle, flashlight beam dancing nervously. The metal was ice cold against my palm. Behind me, gravel shifted. I spun around, heart hammering, light cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Empty yard stretching back to the house, windows glowing yellow and safe. But that wild scent was stronger now, hanging in the air like a promise. When I turned back to the barn, the door had moved. Just an inch wider. But I'd have sworn on my grandfather's grave that I hadn't touched it yet. My thumb found the flashlight switch, and I stepped into the barn's mouth. The beam revealed familiar sights. Hay bales, tools, empty stalls. But shadows seemed to shift and breathe beyond its reach. The familiar scent of hay and old wood should have been comforting, but tonight it felt wrong. Tainted with something wild and musky that made my skin crawl. Above me, a floorboard groaned under weight that shouldn't be there. I swept the light across the empty stalls below, my grandfather's .45 heavy in my other hand. The cattle had refused to come near this place for days, and now I understood why. The silence pressed against my eardrums like water, broken only by the distant settling of wooden beams. Then I heard it. A soft rustling from the hayloft above. Dread pooled in my stomach. I'd filled that loft myself 2 weeks ago, stacking bales in neat rows. Nothing should be up there. Nothing could be up there. Another sound. Deliberate. Something large, shifting its weight across the wooden planks. I raised the flashlight with trembling hands, the beam climbing the ladder rungs to pierce the darkness above. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny spirits, and loose hay drifted down like snow. That's when I saw them, amber yellow eyes, reflecting my flashlight beam with an intensity that stopped my heart. They hung in the blackness 8 feet off the ground, too high for any dog, too high for a man. But it wasn't their height that paralyzed me. It was the intelligence burning behind them. These weren't the simple reactive eyes of a barn cat or raccoon. They studied me with a calculating awareness that made my accounting-trained mind rebel against what I was seeing. Those eyes held knowledge, purpose, and something that looked disturbingly like amusement. The beam wavered as my hands shook. More hay cascaded down, and I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark moving behind the stacked bales. The eyes never blinked, never looked away, just watched me with that terrible knowing gleam. A low sound rumbled through the loft. Not quite a growl, not quite breathing. It vibrated through the barn's wooden frame and into my bones, carrying with it the promise of things my grandfather had tried to warn me about. Those eyes tilted slightly, as if the creature had cocked its head to study me better. The gesture was almost human, which made it infinitely worse. I backed toward the door, flashlight still trained upward, the .45 Colt raised, but feeling pathetically inadequate. Whatever was up there wasn't just watching me anymore. It was deciding what to do with me. The eyes vanished. Not gradually, they simply weren't there anymore, like someone had flicked off a switch. But the sound that followed made my blood turn to ice water. Heavy footsteps moved across the loft beams above me, each one deliberate and measured. Not the scurrying of a raccoon or the flutter of barn owls. These were footfalls with weight behind them, spaced like something walking upright on 2 legs. The ancient wooden beams groaned under whatever was up there. A low rumble filled the barn, part growl, part something else I couldn't name. It started deep in whatever throat was producing it, then rose in pitch until it almost sounded like communication. Like it was trying to tell me something. The hair stood straight up on my neck. On my hay dust drifted down from the loft, visible in my flashlight beam like snow. More footsteps, moving toward the ladder at the far end of the barn. My grandfather's point. 4-5 felt inadequate in my trembling hands. As I realized this thing was planning to come down, I started backing toward the door, keeping the gun trained on the loft opening. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something, maybe the part that remembered my grandfather's warnings, kept me from turning my back on whatever was up there. The footsteps stopped at the ladder's edge. Silence stretched between us, heavy and expectant. I could feel those amber eyes watching me, even though I couldn't see them anymore. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was sure the creature could hear it. Sweat ran down my spine despite the October chill seeping through the barn walls. Then came a sound that nearly broke my nerve entirely, a huffing noise, rhythmic and almost amused. Like whatever was up there was laughing at me. It could have descended, could have ended this right there. But it chose to stay in the loft, letting me retreat, testing whether I'd run or hold my ground. My boot hit the threshold of the barn door. I was outside now, but I kept the gun aimed at that black rectangle of the loft opening. The October wind cut through my work shirt, but I barely felt it. Everything in me wanted to sprint for the house, slam the door, and pretend this wasn't happening. Instead, I backed slowly across the yard, my grandfather's words echoing in my head. Never run from what hunts in the darkness chase. Running only tells it your prey. By the time I reached my porch, the barn looked normal again. Just a weathered building full of hay and farm equipment. But I knew better now. Something was living in my barn, and it was far more intelligent than any animal had a right to be. The next evening, I positioned myself at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My grandfather's revolver sat heavy on the table beside me, its familiar weight offering little comfort. The sun was setting behind the tree line that bordered my property's western edge, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow among the oaks, darker than the gathering dusk, motionless as stone. But as my eyes adjusted, the shadow took shape, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The thing stood nearly 8 feet tall at the tree line, maybe 200 yards from my house. Its posture was wrong, hunched forward like it was perpetually ready to drop to all fours, yet undeniably upright. Massive shoulders tapered down to a narrower waist, and its legs, Christ, its legs bent backward at the knee like a dog's, keeping it balanced on what looked like oversized paws. Shaggy dark fur covered its entire frame, matted and wild-looking even at this distance. But it was the stillness that set my teeth on edge. No animal stands that motionless. No animal watches with that kind of calculated patience. It was studying my house. I fumbled for the binoculars I kept on the windowsill for checking distant cattle. My hands shook as I raised them, and when the creature came into sharp focus, a sound escaped my throat that I didn't recognize as my own voice. The head was pure nightmare. A wolf's skull mounted on a neck that held it too upright, too human in its angle. An elongated muzzle filled with teeth that caught the dying light, some easily an inch long. And the eyes, amber-yellow orbs that gleamed with an intelligence that had no business existing in something that looked like that. As I watched through the binoculars, trying to convince myself I was hallucinating, the creature slowly raised one massive hand. 3-inch claws extended from fingers that were long, too articulated. The gesture was deliberate, almost like a greeting, like it knew I was watching. The distance between us felt both impossibly far and terrifyingly close. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to grab my keys and drive until I hit the ocean. But my grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. Running marks you as prey. The creature lowered its hand and continued its vigil, patient as death itself. It was hunting me, and we both knew it. Then the thing did something that nearly made me drop the binoculars. It turned toward the cattle pen. Every step was calculated, those digitigrade legs carrying its massive frame with an unnatural grace that sent a shiver down my spine. The amber eyes never left my house, never left me, even as it approached the fence line where my remaining cattle huddled in terror. The metal fencing around the pen was heavy-gauge steel, reinforced corners, built to contain 2,000-pound bulls. I'd installed it myself 3 summers ago, pride swelling as I'd tightened every bolt. The creature reached the fence and paused, its wolf-like head tilted slightly, almost thoughtful, before those 3-inch claws extended fully. The sound they made scraping against the metal sent ice through my veins, a high singing screech that seemed to vibrate in my bones. Then it began to tear. Not frantically like an animal, methodically, deliberately. Those razor talons sliced through the steel fencing like it was tissue paper, each stroke precise and controlled. The screech of rending metal echoed across my property, a sound that would haunt my nightmares for weeks to come. Sparks flew in the gathering darkness as the creature peeled back section after section, creating a gaping hole large enough for a truck to drive through. My cattle pressed against the far fence, lowing in absolute terror, but the creature ignored them completely. It wasn't hunting. It was demonstrating. When the destruction was complete, the thing straightened to its full height and turned directly toward my house. Even from this distance, those amber eyes seemed to burn through the binocular lenses, meeting mine with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. Then it threw back that elongated muzzle and released a sound that will follow me to my grave. It started as a howl, deep, resonant, carrying across the fields like thunder. But as it continued, something changed. The tone shifted, modulated, became something else entirely. Something that sounded disturbingly like laughter. Mocking, cruel laughter that seemed to say, "I could have taken your cattle. I could have taken you. But I chose not to. This time." The sound died away, leaving only the panicked lowing of my herd and the whisper of October wind through the destroyed fencing. The creature gave me one final look, almost a nod, then melted back into the tree line with that same impossible stealth. I sat in my kitchen chair, hands shaking as I lowered the binoculars, finally understanding the true scope of my grandfather's warnings. This thing wasn't just hunting me. It was playing with me. I spent the next day preparing my stand. If this thing wanted to play games, I'd give it one final round. I strung up every work light I owned across the barn's interior, floods, shop lights, even my emergency lanterns. No shadows for it to hide in this time. My grandfather's .45 Colt felt heavier than usual in my hands as I checked the cylinder for the dozenth time. 6 rounds of hollow points that I prayed would be enough. I positioned myself in the center of the barn, back against a support beam, with clear sight lines to both entrances. The harsh white light turned everything stark and clinical. Hay bales became geometric blocks. Tools cast sharp shadows on the walls. My cattle lowed nervously in the distance, sensing something wrong with the night. The waiting stretched on. My palms grew slick with sweat, despite the October chill seeping through the barn walls. Every creak of settling wood made my finger twitch toward the trigger. The smell of hay and motor oil usually comforted me. Tonight it felt suffocating. Then the lights began flickering. Not the electrical kind of flicker, but something moving past them outside. Shadows danced across the barn walls in patterns that made no sense. My mouth went dry as I realized the thing was circling the building, studying my setup. The main door groaned on its hinges. I raised the revolver, both hands steady despite the terror clawing at my chest. The door swung open with deliberate slowness, and my barn became my cage. It filled the doorway completely. 8 feet of impossible anatomy hunched forward, massive shoulders tapering to a narrower waist, covered in shaggy dark fur that seemed to absorb the harsh light. Its legs bent wrong, digitigrade like a wolf's, forcing it into that unnatural crouch that somehow made it more terrifying than if it stood fully upright. But the head, Christ, the head was the worst part. a wolf's elongated skull mounted on a neck that held it too upright, too human. Amber eyes burned with something ancient and knowing, a predatory awareness that belonged to no animal I'd ever encountered. Each canine was easily an inch long, gleaming wet in my floodlights. It breathed with a sound like wind through a cave, and when it flexed its hands, 3-inch claws caught the light like polished steel. We stared at each other across 20 feet of illuminated floor. My finger found the trigger, but something in those amber eyes made me hesitate. Not cunning, actual thought, calculation, recognition. Then it made a sound that nearly broke my sanity. A low, rumbling vocalization emerged from that elongated muzzle. Not quite a growl, not quite a howl, but something that vibrated through my chest, like distant thunder. The sound rose and fell in patterns that almost seemed deliberate, almost seemed like it was trying to form words. For one terrifying moment, I could have sworn I heard something like my name buried in that guttural noise. But that was impossible. Wolves don't talk. Monsters don't exist. The revolver trembled in my grip as the creature's amber eyes blinked slowly, studying me with an intelligence that had no right existing in something that looked like that. Another rumbling vocalization, this one longer, more complex. The patterns in the sound made my skin crawl. There was something almost like language in the rhythm, like meaning trying to break through from some inhuman throat. My grandfather's .45 felt impossibly heavy in my trembling hands. The creature took one deliberate step forward on those digity-grayed legs, its 3-inch claws clicking against the concrete floor. The barn's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across its wolf-like features. That elongated muzzle opened slightly, revealing rows of teeth that caught the light like ivory daggers. I remembered my grandfather's stories then. Not just the warnings about what stalked our land, but the older tales. How his own father had faced something in these fields. How the men of our family had always stood their ground. A legacy written in blood and fear that suddenly made terrible sense. The creature's massive head tilted, studying me with that unnerving intelligence. It made another sound. A huffing, rhythmic noise that might have been breathing or might have been something else entirely. Those amber eyes never left mine, and in them I saw something I hadn't expected. Recognition. Not the blind hunger of a predator, but something more calculating, more ancient. It was testing me. The realization hit like ice water. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to empty my grandfather's revolver into that massive chest and pray the bullets would stop what shouldn't exist. But somewhere in my mind, I heard my grandfather's voice from all those years ago. A chase never runs from what needs facing, boy. That's how we've kept this land for 4 generations. I lowered the gun but didn't holster it. My hands still shook, but I met those amber eyes directly. I'm not running. The creature's amber eyes held mine for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, deliberately, it inclined that massive wolf-like head in what I can only describe as a nod of acknowledgement. One final rumbling sound escaped its throat. Lower, almost gentle compared to before. The noise carried something that felt like finality, like a judgment had been rendered. Without another sound, it turned and melted back into the darkness beyond the barn door. One moment, that hulking 8-foot frame filled the doorway. The next, nothing. Only the lingering wild scent and the memory of those knowing eyes remained. I stood there for what felt like hours, my grandfather's revolver still raised, waiting for it to return. But deep down I knew it wouldn't. Not tonight, maybe not for years. But someday, whatever test this had been, I had passed. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm sitting in my kitchen now. The same kitchen where Grandpa used to tell his stories, writing this all down. My hands shake as I form each word, but I force myself to continue. Someone needs to know the truth. I've installed motion sensor lights around the barn and the perimeter of the house. Ordered a new security system that arrives next week. Part of me knows it's useless. What good are lights and cameras against something that's been stalking my family for generations? But it makes me feel like I'm doing something. I keep Grandpa's Colt loaded now, always within reach. The weight of it has become as familiar as my morning coffee. I've practiced at the old shooting range behind the corn crib until I can draw and fire in under 2 seconds. Again, probably useless, but the routine keeps my hands steady. The livestock have returned to normal. The cattle graze near the barn again, and I bought new chickens to replace the ones that scattered. Even got myself a new dog, a German shepherd I named Rex, same as before. He's young, eager, hasn't learned to fear what lurks in the tree line yet. But sometimes, late at night, I catch him staring out toward the woods with his ears pricked forward, listening to something I can't hear. My nephew Jake will inherit this farm someday. He's only 16 now, but he deserves to know what he's walking into. He deserves the warning my grandfather tried to give me. I'm writing this for him, though I doubt he'll believe it any more than I did. The creature, the Dogman, the shadow that walks like a man but hunts like a wolf, it's still out there, waiting, testing each generation to see if we're worthy of the land we claim to own. Some nights, when the wind carries strange sounds across the fields, I remember those amber eyes and that deliberate nod. I think about my grandfather, standing his ground decades ago. I think about Jake and the burden he'll inherit when I'm gone. The pact continues. It always has. And somewhere in the darkness between the corn rows, something watches and waits for the next test to begin.